The moment I stepped into the Meridian Grand Ballroom, I counted 300 people who had no idea what was about to happen. The chandeliers threw warm gold across the room. Waitstaff moved between tables, carrying trays of shrimp cocktail and glasses of champagne that cost more than my first month's rent. A string quartet played something I recognized but couldn't name. At the front of the room, a gleaming banner stretched across the stage, Henderson County Business Excellence Awards, honoring those who give back. My brother was seated at the head table, laughing with the mayor. He looked exactly like what he was, a man who had spent 20 years carefully constructing the appearance of generosity. The tailored navy suit, the practiced smile, the way he tilted his head when someone spoke to him, as if every word they said was the most important thing he'd ever heard. He was good at it. He had always been good at it. I found my assigned seat near the back, which was fine. I preferred the back. My colleague David leaned over. "You sure about this?" I picked up my water glass. "I've never been more sure of anything." He nodded once and didn't ask again. My brother's name was Colin, 8 years older than me. The first thing most people learned about Colin was that he was a self-made success story. Raised in the same modest house I was, same parents, same threadbare Christmases, and yet somehow he had built a multi-million-dollar private foster care network from nothing. Bright Futures Family Services, 12 group homes across the state contracts worth $11 million annually. The second thing people learned about Colin was that he was the kind of man who made sure you knew all of that within the first 5 minutes of meeting him. I had spent most of my adult life existing in Colin's shadow, which was not difficult because Colin cast a very large shadow, and I had spent most of my adult life deliberately standing somewhere else. I was a social worker. I had been a social worker since I graduated from state at 22. Carrying $40,000 in student debt and a conviction that the child welfare system in this country was broken in ways that weren't abstract. They were specific, they were measurable. And some of them could be fixed as the right people paid attention. That was not a glamorous thing to believe. It did not make for good dinner party conversation. It paid $38,000 a year to start, and it cost considerably more than that in the kinds of things that don't show up in a budget. Colin had an opinion about all of this. He shared it regularly. The first time I remember him saying it out loud, I was 24. We were at our parents' house for Thanksgiving, and I had just told him about a sibling group I'd been working with. 3 kids, ages 4 through 9, who had been removed from a home and placed together in a foster family that was genuinely good, genuinely kind. And I had worked for 4 months to make that happen. I was proud of it. I said so. Colin listened to the whole thing, swirled his wine, and said, "That's sweet, Elena, but you know you can't save everyone, right? At some point, you have to ask yourself if you're actually helping, or if you're just making yourself feel better." My mother changed the subject. My father looked at his plate. I smiled and said nothing. That was the first time. By the time I was 28, it had become routine. At family dinners, at holidays, at my cousin's wedding where Colin gave a toast and somehow made a joke about Elena, still out there doing God's work for government wages, people laughed. I smiled. He refilled his glass. When I was 30, I told him I had been promoted to regional supervisor, overseeing child welfare compliance for 6 counties. He said, "Promoted. So what does that mean? You get an extra $1,500 a year?" I told him it meant I was responsible for ensuring that every foster care provider operating in those 6 counties met state licensing standards, that every child in their care was accounted for, that every dollar of state funding was traceable and documented. He looked at me for a moment with something I can only describe as amusement, and then he said, "Elena, the difference between you and me is that I actually built something. You audit people who built something. There's a reason one of those jobs pays what it pays." I went home that night and sat in my car in my apartment parking lot for a long time. Not because he had hurt me. I had passed the point where he could hurt me. Because I had just remembered something. 3 months earlier, one of my case managers, a woman named Patricia who had worked in the system longer than I had and trusted her instincts more than most people trusted, hard evidence, had flagged something in the Bright Futures billing submissions. Small inconsistency at first. A child listed as placed in one of Colin's group homes in Garfield County. Standard documentation, except that Patricia had been to that home 2 weeks prior for a routine inspection, and the staff there had mentioned, casually, that they'd had lower census than usual lately. Only 4 kids, down from 8. But the billing showed 8. Patricia had noted it, flagged it for follow-up, and moved on because she had 47 other cases that week. I had filed it away. Sitting in that parking lot, I pulled out my phone and sent Patricia one message. Can you pull the Bright Futures census reports for Q3 and Q4? All sites. She replied 12 minutes later, already did. You're going to want to see this in person. I want to be precise about what we found, because precision matters in this kind of work. Over a period of approximately 19 months, Bright Futures Family Services had been systematically billing the state for children who were not in their care, not rounding errors, not paperwork delays, ghost placements, children whose cases had been closed, transferred, or in 3 instances had aged out of the system entirely, but who continued to appear on census documentation submitted to the state for reimbursement at the per diem rate of $68 per child per day. When we cross-referenced the billing with actual placement records, the discrepancy across all 12 sites came to just under $900,000 over the 19-month period. I sat with that number for a long time. $900,000 billed to the state of Michigan for children who were not there. I thought about the group home in Garfield County where the staff had mentioned their census was low. I thought about the corporate office that Bright Futures had renovated the year before, the one Colin had posted photographs of on LinkedIn, all glass walls and standing desks and a coffee bar in the lobby. I thought about the conference he had spoken at in Scottsdale in February, the one where he'd given a keynote about building sustainable nonprofit infrastructure. I thought about my brother at Thanksgiving saying, at some point you have to ask yourself if you're actually helping. I did not call Colin. I called our state's Office of Inspector General. What followed was not fast. It was not dramatic in the way that things are dramatic in movies. It was meticulous. It was careful. It involved a lot of spreadsheets and a lot of conference calls with people who spoke in very measured tones and asked very precise questions. It involved the FBI field office in Detroit, which became interested roughly 6 weeks after I made my first call. Once they had reviewed what we'd sent them and determined that the federal foster care funding that flowed through the state program made this a matter that was not exclusively Michigan's problem. It took 8 months. During those 8 months, I attended 3 family events where Colin was present. I smiled. I asked about his kids. I listened to him explain to our Uncle Pete that the foster care sector was actually incredibly competitive right now. Private operators are under a lot of pressure from state regulators who don't understand the economics. I nodded. I ate my dinner. He had no idea. The most important thing I learned during those 8 months was something I already knew professionally but had never felt personally until then. Power is not loud. Power does not announce itself at the dinner table. Power is the person in the room who already knows the ending while everyone else is still reading the first chapter. My brother was very loud. I was very quiet. 6 weeks before the Henderson County Business Excellence Awards, Colin received the news that Bright Futures had been nominated for the Cornerstone Award, the gala's highest honor for community impact. He actually called me, which he almost never did, to tell me about it. He was effusive. He said it was recognition of what we've been building. He said it was proof that doing things right pays off. I said, "Congratulations, Colin. That sounds like a big night." He said, "You should come. It'll be good for you to see what scale looks like." I said, "I'll be there." I did not tell him that 3 days earlier, the licensing division under my office had formally initiated non-renewal proceedings for Bright Futures Family Services, pending the conclusion of the OIG investigation. I did not tell him that the FBI had completed its financial forensics and was prepared to move. I did not tell him that 2 of his regional directors had already been interviewed and one of them had been cooperating for 11 weeks. I bought a dress, navy blue. I had my hair done. I drove to the Meridian Grand Ballroom and found my seat near the back and waited. The program moved through its early awards with the pleasant efficiency of these things. Small Business of the Year, Young Entrepreneur, Community Volunteer. People applauded, accepted their plaques, said gracious things into the microphone. Colin sat at the head table with the kind of relaxed confidence that comes from a man who has already decided he is the most important person in the room and is simply waiting for the rest of the room to confirm it. When the MC announced the Cornerstone Award, the room responded with a warmth that made my chest ache a little. These were real people who genuinely believed in what Colin had told them he was doing. That was the part that was always hardest. The people in between. Colin walked to the stage to warm applause. He buttoned his jacket. He shook the MC's hand. He accepted the plaque and held it up and smiled that practiced smile, and I watched 300 people smile back at him. And I thought about a 7-year-old girl named Destiny whose case had been closed 14 months ago, but whose name had still been appearing on the Garfield County billing submissions as of last March. Per diem rate, $68 a day. Destiny had not been in that home for 14 months. 14 months times 30 days times $68, $28,560. Billed, collected, spent. Colin leaned into the microphone. I want to start, he said, by acknowledging my family, who have always supported what I do. He found my mother in the crowd and nodded at her. She pressed her hand to her heart. Then he found me. His eyes moved past me almost instantly. The near the back table, the navy dress, the sister who audited things. But then he stopped. Looked back. He smiled. Not the practiced one. Something smaller. Something that had a whole childhood in it. My sister Elena is here tonight, he said. She works for the state. She's always been the one in our family who thought government programs could fix things. He chuckled lightly. A few people in the room chuckled with him. I love her for that. I really do. It's good to have idealists in the family. Keeps the rest of us honest. A small laugh moved through the room. I was already standing up. David put his hand on my arm, not to stop me, just contact, just I'm here. And then I was moving through the tables toward the stage, and I was aware of the confused looks from the people I passed. A woman in a navy dress, walking with very deliberate steps toward a stage where her brother was holding a plaque. And I was also aware of something very quiet and very settled in the center of my chest that had been building for 8 months and longer than that. Longer than that. And I climbed the 3 steps to the stage, and I walked to the microphone, and Colin turned to look at me with an expression that started as confusion and moved through several other things very quickly. I touched his arm gently, the way you touch someone when you need to move them slightly to the left. He moved. I took the microphone. Thank you, I said to the room, and my voice was steady, and I was grateful for that. I know this is unconventional. I apologize to the organizers. This won't take long. The room had gone very still. 300 people and the quiet of held breath. My name is Elena Marsh. My brother just introduced me as the family idealist, which is generous. I paused. He also called me a government auditor, which is accurate. Specifically, I'm the Regional Director of Child Welfare Licensing for Districts 4 through 9, which means that for the past 2.5 years, my office has been responsible for ensuring that every private foster care provider in 6 counties is doing exactly what they say they're doing with the public money they receive. I felt Colin shift beside me. I did not look at him. I want to tell you something about my brother's organization. Bright Futures Family Services received $11 million in state and federal funding last year to care for children in foster placement. That's real money for a real purpose, and most of the people who work in his group homes, the caseworkers, the house managers, the overnight staff, they are doing genuinely hard work for not nearly enough pay. I want to say that clearly. I reached into the small clutch I had carried to my seat and removed a single folded document. I unfolded it. What my office found over a 19-month audit period is that Bright Futures billed the state for $887,000 in placements that did not exist. Children listed in census documents who had not been in those homes, some for weeks, some for months. In one case, a child who had aged out of the system 11 months prior continued to generate per diem billing from a Garfield County site. The silence in that ballroom was the kind that has texture. I could feel it. I reported these findings to the Office of the Inspector General 8 months ago. I want to be precise about the timeline because my brother knew about the investigation from the moment it began. Not for me, but because his regional directors were contacted. He chose to submit his application for this award anyway. He chose to accept it tonight. Colin's hand closed around my arm. Hard. Elena, he said, very low, very controlled. You need to stop talking right now. I covered the microphone with my palm, turned to look at him for the first time since I'd climbed the stairs. His face was the color of old chalk. I know, I said quietly, just to him. I know you think I've always been the one who couldn't compete with you. The government salary, the idealism, the sister who cared too much about things that didn't matter. I held his gaze. I've been investigating your organization for 8 months, Colin. The FBI has been involved for 6. 2 of your regional directors have been cooperating for 11 weeks. I let that sit for a moment. You submitted billing for children who weren't there. You used that money for a lobby renovation and a conference in Scottsdale. I've seen the invoices. His hand dropped from my arm. I turned back to the microphone. Effective as of 48 hours ago, Bright Futures Family Services has been formally notified of non-renewal of its state operating license, pending conclusion of a joint OIG and federal investigation. The children currently in placement are being safely transitioned to other providers. I set the document on the podium. I'm sorry for the disruption to your evening. The award committee may want to reconsider the plaque. I stepped back from the microphone. What happened next was not loud. That's the thing people always expect. They expect the confrontation, the raised voices, the dramatic collapse. What actually happened was quieter than that and somehow worse. Colin stood at the microphone for a moment without speaking. The practiced smile was completely gone. In its place was something I had never seen on my brother's face before. Not anger, which I had seen, not contempt, which I had seen many times, but something that looked frighteningly close to the face of a man who was just understood, all at once, the full weight of something he cannot put down. He walked off the stage. He did not take the plaque. I walked down the 3 steps and back through the tables, and people moved aside, and David was waiting at the back, and he handed me my coat without saying anything. At the door, one of the event coordinators caught my arm, a young woman with a headset and a clipboard and an expression of complete bewilderment. Ma'am, I need to know. Call the number on the press release, I said. The OIG has a public information contact. They can answer questions. Outside, the air had the clean bite of early November, that particular cold that smells like the end of something. I stood on the steps of the Meridian Grand for a moment and breathed it in. My phone buzzed. Text from my mother, Elena. What just happened? I put the phone back in my pocket. The formal charges were filed 11 days later. Colin's attorney released a statement saying his client vigorously disputed the characterization of the billing discrepancies and looked forward to presenting his side at the appropriate proceedings. The statement was 4 paragraphs long and said nothing. 3 of his board members resigned before the week was out. The lobby renovation, the one with the standing desks and the coffee bar, had cost $212,000. The contractor invoices, which my office had already obtained, showed the project was paid from operating funds during a period when 4 of the 12 homes reported below capacity census. The FBI had the invoices. They also had the emails. There were a lot of emails. My mother called me the Sunday after the gala. We talked for a long time. She said things that were hard to hear, and I listened to them, and I said things back that I meant. She cried. I did not, which surprised me until it didn't. I had spent a long time with this. I had turned it over and looked at it from every side. There was nothing left in it that could surprise me. Near the end of the call, she said, "He's your brother, Elena." "I know," I said. How could you do this to him publicly, in front of all those people? I thought about Destiny. I thought about her name on a billing document for 14 months after she had left. I thought about $68 a day multiplied by 14 months and what that sum had purchased instead of what it was supposed to purchase. Mom, I said, the money was for children. It was supposed to go to children. That's not abstract. Those are specific kids with specific names and specific needs, and it went somewhere else. I let a moment pass. I didn't do this to Colin. I did this because of them. She was quiet for a long time after that. She said, I know. And that was the hardest part, actually. Not the confrontation, not the investigation, not standing in front of 300 people and watching my brother's face change. The hardest part was that I believed her. I believed she knew. Some people in this world will look directly at a thing and choose, very deliberately, not to see it. Because seeing it costs something. Because the person doing the harm is someone they love, and loving someone is its own kind of debt that feels impossible to default on. I understood that. I had spent years understanding it. But I had also spent years sitting across tables from children who had been failed by exactly that logic. By the accumulated weight of all the adults in their lives who had known something and chosen to stay quiet because speaking meant losing something they valued more than the truth. I had sat across tables from those children, and I had written their names in case files, and I had told them, in the careful clinical language I was trained to use, that what happened to them was not their fault. The least I could do was mean it. Colin's preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following March. His legal team was good, expensive, and good, and the process moved at the pace these things move, which is slow and deliberate and deeply unsexy compared to the way the law works on television. There were motions, there were continuances, there were sealed documents and procedural arguments and stretches of weeks where nothing visible happened at all. I went to work. I drove my regular route in the morning. I made coffee in the office kitchen. I sat in meetings and reviewed case files and took calls from case managers in the field and answered every one of them because every one of them mattered. I did my job. I got a card in the mail about 3 weeks after the gala from Patricia, the case manager who had first flagged the census discrepancy. She had written, "You followed the thread. That's all we can ever do." She had drawn a small star next to her signature because Patricia was that kind of person, and I put the card in my desk drawer, and it is still there. The Cornerstone Award Committee sent a formal letter to my office requesting a consultation. They were reviewing their nomination process. They wanted to understand what oversight mechanisms they should be incorporating going forward. I referred them to our public documentation guidelines and offered to connect them with our outreach coordinator. I saw Colin once more before the hearing. It was at our parents' house, at Christmas, which felt both impossible and inevitable. He came with his wife and their 2 kids. I came alone. We sat in the same living room where we had sat every Christmas of our lives, under the same lights our fathers strung every year in exactly the same way, and we ate the same food our mother had been making since before either of us could remember. We did not speak directly to each other for most of the evening. Near the end of the night, when most people had moved into the living room, I went to the kitchen for a glass of water and Colin was standing at the counter. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then, he said, "I built something real, Elena. Whatever they say, whatever you think you found, I built something real." I ran the water. I let it get cold. I filled my glass. "Some of it was real," I said. "The staff in those homes, most of them are good people. Some of what you built was real." He looked at me. "Then why?" "Because some of it wasn't." I turned off the tap. "And you knew." I went back to the living room. Outside, on the drive home, the highway was empty and the sky was that particular deep winter dark that feels like the world has been cleaned of everything extra. I thought about a question one of my case managers had asked me early in my career, when I was new enough to still be surprised by how hard it was. How do you keep going when it feels like the system is too broken to fix? I had given her a professional answer at the time. Something about systemic change and incremental progress and the importance of maintaining perspective. It was true but incomplete. What I knew now, at 31, driving home on an empty highway in the middle of December, was something simpler and less elegant. You keep going because the alternative is letting the people who know the system is broken use that fact as cover. You keep going because someone has to read the documents. Someone has to follow the thread. Someone has to be in the room who already knows the ending. My brother had spent 20 years believing the thing that powerful people often believe, that the people beneath them in the hierarchy don't really see what's happening, that the auditors and the case managers and the government salary workers are too busy with their small tasks to look up and notice the larger shape of things. He was wrong about that. He had been wrong about that for a very long time. I merged onto the interstate and turned the heat up and drove home through the clean dark, and I thought the checkmate was set long before he knew there was a game.